This is a conversation about how we can cascade strategy from the top of the organization down to the department, team, and even individual level, and then cascade or boil the right KPIs back up to the top. We're going to talk about the mechanisms that we've learned over the last 30 years to effectively capture and cascade strategy without it being diluted or losing focus, and making sure that each team understands what their contribution is to the overall performance. And then building performance-centric KPIs back up that can be used for monitoring performance, engaging employees, and even for compensation and rewards. So, as we know, best practices in capturing strategy are a strategy map. Now, I'll link to other videos that can explain how this was produced, but the net is we capture the existing corporate strategic objectives, these things in these white rectangles, and their priorities for this year. From there, we can obviously capture KPIs at the corporate level, whether each strategic goal has just one measure, or if it's an index of multiple measures that aggregate up to give you the performance against that strategic objective. But it's important to note this is a top-down view and doesn't identify what do the individual teams and individuals do to contribute to that. So this top-level metrics, obviously we can overlay on the strategy map so that we now have the ability to see how we're performing. Again, think of this at the aggregate level, the corporation, the business unit, the department, maybe even the team if there's a strategic element to it. And we should be able to drill into each of these metrics to understand what the trends are against target and other comparatives, as well as taking a look at linked projects, initiatives, and so forth. So that's the traditional top-down balanced scorecard type view. What we now want to talk about is how it is we can, in a simple, standard, repeatable way, drill down to the team and individual. And we've been working with many universities and corporations over the last 30 years to develop a simple, repeatable, and reliable process to do this. Now, this process has come to be named the corporate ontology. Now, an ontology is, think of, say, the periodic table. We've identified the relationship between electrons and neutrons, and because of that, we can identify every material that can possibly exist. We can do the same thing in your organization by taking a look at the strategic goals that we just identified and what we do, the processes and projects that we live in. So let me explain how we can help you build your ontology. And from there, help the lowest levels of the organization identify their KPIs by breaking down those high-level strategic objectives and KPIs to make it relevant to them, the people on the shop floor, the call center. So first thing is we have to take a look at your processes. What are the things that you do that are the core activities inside the organization? So for this client, they had value streams or processes such as sales and customer service, purchasing, R&D and product development, quality assurance. And some of these names might be familiar to you. In fact, in many cases, they may appear to be your department names because many times we set up departments around core processes. We put the HR people together and we call it a department, but it's really just a bunch of HR processes. So we should be able to take those processes and strategic goals and see how they relate to each other. Specifically, we'll put the strategic goals down the left side of a spreadsheet. And across the top, we'll put those core processes that we identified. Because, of course, we do these core processes in aid of achieving these objectives. So through the ontology, what we want to do is assess the impact of this process on our ability to achieve this strategic goal. Obviously, if a process has a higher impact on a higher weighted goal, by definition, that process is more important. Let's take a look at this in more detail. So we're now just drilled into the top left corner of the spreadsheet. So we're going to take a look at the process of sales and customer service. And we're going to ask ourselves, what is the impact of this process, sales and customer service, on this strategic goal, grow profitably? So if you think about it, some teams phrase it this way. If this process stopped functioning, could we achieve this strategic goal? Or you could look at it the other way. If we knocked it out of the park with this process, could we exceed expectations greatly with this strategic objective? And we're going to score it from 1 to 5, where 1, well, blank says it has no impact, 1 is minimal, and 5 is it's, critical for strategic success. So in this case, the team is scored at 5. They've said sales and customer service is critical to the success of Grow Profitably. So we're going to color that gray based on the combination of weighting and impact. In fact, we multiply the two, so this cell effectively has 25 strategy points. The next one, they scored as an impact of 3. Well, 3 times 5 is 15. That's a light gray. And here they scored these at 5 and also at 5. But here, of course, it's 5 times 12, or 60. And that triggers this to turn black. So what's interesting about this is now the team can understand and assess their impact on strategic success. And they themselves can identify where they have a higher impact and therefore where their processes need to perform at a higher standard. So now when we look at the complete ontology, we can begin to see a holistic view of how this organization needs to perform in order to support strategic success. And again, you can think of this as a bottom-up approach. It's the sales and customer service team that scored themselves. It's the purchasing team that has scored themselves. Now, normally we do it with all those teams in the room. And that helps us both normalize what's a 5 and what's a 1, but more importantly, keep each other honest. So some processes might get carried away and assess their importance and impact as higher. So the other teams will help correct them over time. Now we can begin to see some patterns. So for example, we can see that some processes have a lot of critical touch points, some not so many. In fact, if you had one team that ran both these processes, now they could begin to figure out across multiple processes where to spend their time. In fact, because these are just numbers, we can give you that score. We can add up the score of multiplying weighting by impact down the column. And this process, for this strategy, for this client, sales and customer service added up to 351 strategy points, whereas finance was 188 as an example. And so the Harvey balls help us identify where the supercritical processes are for this strategy. And I keep emphasizing this strategy because if partway through the year we changed our priorities, we made an acquisition, we decided to pursue a new market space or a new customer group, these weightings would change. Now, I don't have to reassess the processes, but these shadings will automatically change. So for example, if this 13 went down to 2 and this 2 went up to 13, now this box would be red and this box would be the light gray. In fact, that's how we build agility into these self-managed work teams, because now we can instantly understand what the impact is in changing our strategy over time. It allows us to do other things as well, such as scenario planning, better human resources and capacity planning, competency planning, and so forth. We can also see things horizontally. And for many clients, this is quite revealing because they don't normally have this view. It's quite normal that I look at things by department, but I don't normally look at it by strategic objective. So now I can take a look at this strategic objective, increase share of high performance customers. And let's pretend for a second we're a team that owns this process or this goal. We can now see which processes are super critical to our success. We can see which ones are important and which ones have a lesser role. What this allows us to do is make sure that we're getting the right team, the natural work team, horizontally by strategic objective, put together to help solve this problem. It also allows us to make sure that we're creating the correct value stream across these processes in order to deliver this strategic objective. Now we can take this a step further. As the teams identify their own KPIs, so I'll go back to this chart for a second. If, for example, we own sales and customer service, as we get together as a team to take the next step, identify our KPIs, obviously the first place we need to find KPIs for are where the black is. And those are the supercritical important indicators we need. Now, if we want some more indicators, we're going to hit the dark gray ones. Later on, if we want to, in a third pass, we can go get the light gray ones. But it's important to note, we don't have to measure them all. We just have to measure these important parts and maybe the dark gray ones as well over time. So this allows us to think and get the right KPIs which are important to the business. So we've done the top-down, strategy into processes. Now we do the bottom-up. I own this process, and these are the KPIs we would forward to the organization to measure how well we're achieving those goals. So what does that look like? Well, we can now, in addition to scoring the impact that we saw before, I can also score the performance. And it's a similar scale. I'm going to score it. A says I'm meeting expectations. What my budget asks for, I'm achieving that number. Not world class or best in the galaxy, but what my budget says I should be doing. And down to F. F means I'm doing fairly poorly. So in this case, a C means we're sort of meeting expectations, but there's some improvement required. So the combination of a weighting of 5, an impact of 4, and a performance of C gives us a green performance. That's okay. We don't need to worry about it, is what green means. So now when we go back to the full ontology, we quickly identify places where there are significant performance gaps based on the impact and the weighting of that objective. Now, this is an intriguing dashboard to look at. And the reason it's interesting is it clearly depicts management's priorities, that top-down view. It depicts our knowledge of how well we impact the success of those objectives. And it has our KPIs in it around how we're performing to meet those goals. So it's an interesting camaraderie between the senior leadership team and the individuals in the organization. Now, it's important to understand how this dashboard works. It's quite intriguing. So here are two cases where we have an impact of 5 and a performance at the D level. But in this case, it's red. In this case, it's yellow. Why is that? Well, this impact of 5 and performance of D relates to a really important objective, 13%, whereas this one relates to a less important objective at 4%. So what happens is the more important a strategic objective is, the higher quality we need from the underlying processes to achieve success. And therefore, this D is unacceptable, whereas this D is, again, unacceptable, but we can probably fix that within the budgets we have. So this ontology allows us to put our performance in context, because a D is not always a bad thing. I might want to prioritize a C that has a higher weighting. So if I go back and take a look at this, here I have a C that's red, and I have, the D that's red before. Well, now we understand that both this C and this D need our focus. But over here we have a B that's a yellow. So it allows us to prioritize our activities in a much more effective way and in an aligned fashion. Now the fun part is, if we do change the weighting, these colors will also change because they're impacted by the weighting. In other words, as I change my strategy, this dashboard will dynamically show me what our new priorities are without having to come up with new KPIs or do a new impact assessment. Now, this is just a table of numbers. We could actually add this up by strategic objective to show you how we're performing. To read this, the height of the bar represents the amount of process support we need to achieve this strategic objective. The blue part represents how well we're currently doing, and the gold is a gap between current performance and what the strategy calls for. So what this allows us to do is quickly discover where are the strategic performance gaps in our processes. So for example, if I had $1 to spend in process improvement, would I spend it here, I2 improve product mix, or P2 live the Scott Batter values? Obviously, I'm going to move here because there's a far bigger gap in performance. So again, the way to read this is the total height are the amount of process support we need, the gold part is the gap, and the blue part is how we're currently performing. So now all of a sudden, this ontology has made our strategic success visible. Now, we can also add that up by process. And this gives us a similar chart. In this case, the purple shows us how well we're currently performing, and the silver is the gap. And again, allows us to figure out which processes we need to focus on in order to achieve better support within this team. Now, going back to that overall process gap, remember we had those gold bars, which are the gaps. So the other activity you do other than processes are projects. Projects are things we do to address these performance gaps. So in theory, every year when you come up with your budget and your annual project plans, what you're doing is coming up with projects to address these issues. So guess what? We can score them the same way. So for this client, we listed the projects that they're going to be working on. And then we scored those projects for their impact, just like we did for the process. So again, for this project, how many resources does it take? We scaled it from 1 to 10, 10 being the most expensive project. And what is its impact on this strategic goal? Again, 1 to 5. And when we score all of their projects, we can see that, again, some projects have a much higher impact on success than other projects. So all of a sudden, we can begin to prioritize unlike projects to make sure that we fund the projects that have the maximum strategic benefit based on the resources consumed. In fact, we can do the same thing. We can add up their impact and score them as these red dots. So the higher the red dot, the more impact our project portfolio has. So we're going to use this right axis for the project impacts. Now, the question is, what's your guess about does the profile of these red dots match the profile of those gold bars? In other words, do we have our projects correctly aligned with the strategic gaps? Now, this is a great client example because this shows remarkably good alignment. Now, yes, there are some where the dot's significantly above, and there's others where it's below. But within the degree of science that we've used, this is a pretty darn good profile. There's always some that go over, even if it's just because of unintended consequences. I might be working on a different project, but it has spin-off benefits over here. In other cases, the projects might have a better impact than we imagine. This gap might be smaller than imagined, or over the course of time, these two things change. Regardless, we're trying to take a look at any huge discrepancies that we see between project proposals and gaps. Now, this particular profile, we might want to take a look at more projects around better share of high performance customers and perhaps minimizing the impact. But beyond that, this does not look all that bad. We can also take a look at individual projects, looking at a return on resources. Now, what's interesting about this is this allows us to correctly assess multi-year projects. In a traditional financial sense, I'm looking at a return on investment, which is all about this year's accounting period. Because we're now using strategy points, we go beyond this year's investment portfolio and return to what is our longer term investment. So the higher the bar, the better the return on resources are. So in this case, the transferring the resin from the UK to Croatia is going to give us the best payback and gives us pretty reasonable benefits. In other cases, we can find a lower return on resources, but a higher impact. So this allows us to choose which projects make the sense for us to invest in this year. All of this begins to underpin a new operating system. Now, to get self-directed work teams, or what some people call holacracy, and there's many other terms for it, research indicates there's about 5 things you need. You need the team to have a clear vision. From that vision, they have to have their interpretation of direction. From the direction, they have to have very clearly defined expectations. What are the targets for that team? Then we have to make sure that everyone understands their accountability and owns those KPIs. Then leadership and employees have to trust each other to make that piece of machinery work. And then finally, we need a coaching culture where we help each other achieve those goals. Now, what's interesting is here at Scott Batter, we have many of those parts already built in as our commonwealth and approach to business. So we have our vision and direction. Instead of talking about defined expectations, in our values, we talk about our personal responsibility. Instead of accountability and KPIs, we call that our commitment. That's another of our values. This leadership employee trust is in fact what the Commonwealth is all about. And this coaching culture, of course, is our value of teamwork. So we already have this framework in place, and the mechanism I've just described to you is an overlay to make that successful. The vision comes from your own documents. The direction comes from those strategy maps and weightings. Your personal responsibility comes from the work that you and your team do to create your ontology around what is your responsibility. The commitment comes from making that available and part of your ongoing performance management processes. The Commonwealth itself is how it is we see the performance in a holistic way, not just silo by silo, and we help each other work towards these goals. And that's also part of teamwork. How do we embed that into our daily, weekly, monthly, and ongoing strategy conversations to keep becoming a learning organization and making ourselves better and better over time? So I hope this gives you a detailed walkthrough of how it is we take the corporate strategy down to the team and individual level, and then allow them to choose the right KPIs that boil back up to corporate performance. I look forward to working with you on this project.